Inside Angola Prison, America's most feared prison where inmates go to die. The alarm didn't just ring, it screamed. Red lights flashed across the tier of closed cell restricted housing at Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola. Metal doors slammed shut one after another. Boots pounded down the concrete walkway. A correctional officer shouted, "Lock it down! Lock it down!" Inside a narrow 6 by 9 foot cell, Herman Wallace stood perfectly still. For 41 years, he had lived almost every day alone in that concrete box. 23 hours a day in isolation. No human touch. No physical contact. Just a slot in the steel door for food trays and handcuffs. And now, in October 2013, something had shifted. A federal court had just ruled that his decades-long solitary confinement was unconstitutional. The conviction that kept him in that cell had been overturned. But Angola was not built to let men walk out quietly. As officers moved down the tier, other inmates began pounding on their doors. The sound echoed like gunfire. Some shouted Wallace's name. Some cursed the system. Some just screamed into the steel. After more than 4 decades in isolation, Herman Wallace was about to leave the prison that many called America's most feared. But Angola wasn't finished with him yet. Because behind that ruling was a story that stretched back to blood, fear, and one of the most controversial prison cases in American history. And it began long before the alarms ever sounded. In 1972, Angola was already infamous. Built on 18,000 acres of former plantation land, it housed thousands of violent offenders. Inmates worked the fields under armed supervision. Stabbings were common. Racial tension ran high. The prison had a reputation as one of the bloodiest in America. Herman Wallace arrived there after being convicted of armed robbery. He was serving a 50-year sentence. Inside Angola, Wallace became associated with a small group of inmates who called themselves the Black Panther Party chapter within the prison. They spoke openly about inmate rights, racial abuse, and guard brutality. In a place like Angola in the early 1970s, that alone made them targets. Then, on April 17, 1972, a young correctional officer named Brent Miller was found dead in a cell block. He had been stabbed. The prison went into immediate lockdown. Investigators quickly focused on Wallace and another inmate, Albert Woodfox. Both men were accused of the murder, largely based on inmate testimony that would later be questioned for its reliability. Within months, Wallace was convicted. But instead of being placed in the general population, he was moved into solitary confinement, what Angola called closed cell restricted, where he would remain not for weeks, not for years, but for decades. Officials claimed he was too dangerous for the yard. Too influential. Too much of a threat to order. What no one knew at the time was that this decision would spark one of the longest-running solitary confinement cases in U.S. history. And inside that concrete box, something was beginning to change, not just in Wallace, but in the prison system itself. The question wasn't whether Angola could break a man. The question was what happens when it doesn't. The door slammed shut with a hollow, metallic finality. For Herman Wallace, that sound would become the soundtrack of his life. Closed cell restricted at Louisiana State Penitentiary was designed for control. Each cell was a concrete box. Solid steel door. Narrow window. A bunk bolted to the wall. A small desk. A toilet that flushed on command from outside. Lights that never truly went dark. 23 hours a day alone. 1 hour to walk alone in a small yard, often just another cage. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into years. At first, prison officials justified Wallace's isolation by labeling him a security threat. They claimed he had influence. That he organized inmates. That he challenged authority. In Angola during the 1970s, power was everything. Order was maintained through fear. Anyone who threatened that balance was removed. But as the years passed, something became harder to explain. Most inmates placed in solitary served months. Sometimes a few years. Wallace stayed. 5 years. 10 years. 20. Every few months, a review board would meet. The process was brief. Officials would check boxes on a form. Wallace remained in isolation. No new violent infractions. No escape attempts. Still, the answer was the same. Denied. The psychological pressure was constant. In isolation, time stretches and bends. You lose track of seasons. You forget the sound of normal conversation. Some men screamed through the night. Others talked to themselves. A few stopped talking at all. Wallace adapted in small ways. He exercised in his cell. Read books. Filed legal paperwork. Wrote letters. He and Albert Woodfox, housed separately, communicated by shouting through pipes and vents when they could. But even resilience has limits. Former guards would later admit that extended solitary changed men. Some officers believed isolation kept the prison safe. Others quietly wondered if it was creating deeper instability. A man alone for decades has nothing left to lose. Meanwhile, outside the razor wire, attorneys and activists began questioning the case. Witness testimony from 1972 was re-examined. Allegations surfaced that key evidence had been withheld. Critics argued that Wallace and Woodfox were kept in solitary not for ongoing violence, but because of their political beliefs and influence. Court appeals were filed. Convictions were challenged. Each time a hearing was scheduled, hope flickered inside that concrete cell. Each time it was denied, the steel door felt heavier. By the early 2000s, Wallace had spent more than 30 years in isolation, longer than almost anyone in American history. Angola had built a system to contain danger. But now the nation was watching. And in a federal courtroom, a judge was preparing to ask a question that Angola never expected. Had this prison buried a man alive for 40 years without justification? The answer would shake the prison to its core. The courtroom was silent when the ruling came down. In 2013, after decades of appeals, a federal judge overturned Herman Wallace's conviction. The court ruled that his 1974 trial had been deeply flawed. Critical evidence had been withheld. The indictment itself was declared unconstitutional. Inside Louisiana State Penitentiary, word spread fast. For more than 40 years, Wallace had woken up to the same concrete walls. Now, at age 71, the state of Louisiana was ordered to release him immediately. But there was something prison officials could not ignore. Herman Wallace was dying. He had been diagnosed with advanced liver cancer. His body had weakened during decades in isolation. He could barely stand without assistance. The man the prison once described as a threat now weighed little more than 120 pounds. Still, the tension inside Angola was real. Some officers felt anger. A correctional officer had been murdered in 1972. For them, this was about Brent Miller, a young father who never went home. They believed justice had already been decided long ago. Others felt something more complicated, exhaustion, maybe even doubt. Because Wallace had spent over 41 years in solitary confinement. Even for the most violent offenders, that number was almost unimaginable. On October 1, 2013, guards escorted him out of the closed cell-restricted unit for the last time. No riot. No shouting. Just the heavy sound of boots and the slow roll of a wheelchair down a concrete corridor. The same hallway where doors had slammed shut for decades now opened. Outside the prison gates, cameras waited. Supporters gathered. Lawyers stood close, unsure how much time he had left. The state fought back quickly, announcing plans to retry him. Angola's administration maintained that Wallace had been properly convicted. The legal battle was not over. But for the first time since the early 1970s, Herman Wallace breathed air that wasn't filtered through prison vents. He was taken to a hospital in New Orleans. 3 days later, he was dead. His death didn't end the story. Instead, it ignited a national debate about solitary confinement in America. Human rights groups pointed to Wallace's 41 years in isolation as proof of systemic cruelty. Law enforcement groups defended restrictive housing as a necessary tool to control the most dangerous inmates. Meanwhile, Albert Woodfox remained behind bars, still in isolation, still fighting his own case. Inside Angola, the steel doors continued to shut every night. Inmates still walked the fields under watchtowers. Solitary cells remained occupied. The system hadn't collapsed. But something had cracked. Because once the world saw what 40 years alone in a concrete box could do to a human being, one question refused to fade. Was Angola protecting society, or preserving a punishment that time itself had already condemned?